The rain fell in steady sheets as Diane Reynolds stood across the street from the 34th precinct, watching officers come and go through the glass doors. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. After 20 years in law enforcement, she'd faced countless challenges, but this one felt different, more personal. More important, she checked her reflection in a storefront window. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore simple gold studs in her ears. No uniform today. Just a navy blazer, cream blouse, and tailored pants. Professional but unremarkable. Her badge and credentials were tucked away in her purse, not to be revealed until next week's official ceremony. "You've got this," she whispered to herself, a habit from her rookie days that still calmed her nerves. The plan had been her idea. Before officially taking over as chief, she wanted to see the precinct as it truly operated, not the polished version that would inevitably be presented to a new boss. The mayor had been skeptical but ultimately agreed. No one at the station knew who she was or that she was coming. To them, she'd just be another visitor, another face passing through. Diane crossed the street, dodging puddles. The building itself was imposing, all concrete and authority, worn around the edges in a way that suggested decades of use. She'd read the files, of course. The 34th had once been a model precinct, but in recent years, community complaints had risen while morale and performance had declined. Her job was to turn it around. She pulled open the heavy glass door, shaking raindrops from her coat as she stepped inside. The lobby smelled of floor cleaner and wet uniforms. A desk sergeant sat behind a high counter, filling out paperwork without looking up. The wall behind him displayed photos of officers alongside community service awards, most dated from 10 years ago or more. Diane approached the desk and waited. When the sergeant still didn't acknowledge her, she cleared her throat. "What?" he finally said, eyes still on his paperwork. "Good morning," Diane replied pleasantly. "I'm looking for the detective division." The sergeant, Officer Burkett, according to his nameplate, finally glanced up. His eyes did a quick assessment, lingering on her rain-damp hair and dark skin. Something flickered across his face, so brief another person might have missed it, but Diane had seen that look countless times throughout her career. "Third floor," he said flatly, jerking his thumb toward the elevators. "Visitors need to sign in." He pushed a clipboard toward her, and Diane signed her real name. If anyone bothered to check later, they'd find it. But she doubted they would. "What's your business?" Burkett asked, still not making eye contact. "Research," she replied. Not technically a lie. She was researching how the precinct operated. "I'm working on department efficiency." That earned her a grunt and a visitor's badge, which she clipped to her blazer before walking to the elevators. As she waited, she observed the flow of the lobby, which officers nodded to each other, which ones talked, which ones walked alone. Small details that told big stories. The elevator arrived with a ping, and she stepped inside alongside two uniformed officers who were mid-conversation. Told him to just write it up as a disturbance and be done with it, the taller one was saying. Not worth the paperwork otherwise. Rivera's got to stick up his... The shorter officer stopped when he noticed Diane, giving her a curt nod before both men fell silent. The doors opened on the third floor, and Diane followed the signs to the detective division. The bullpen was a large open room filled with desks arranged in pairs. About half were occupied, detectives hunched over computers or talking on phones. The walls needed painting and the carpet was worn to threads in high-traffic areas. A coffee station in the corner had a handwritten sign, "Fix what you finish." Diane walked with purpose toward an empty desk in the corner. In her experience, acting like you belonged somewhere was half the battle. She set down her bag and took out her tablet, a notebook, and a pen. From here, she had a clear view of most of the room. A middle-aged man with sleeves rolled up and a loosened tie approached. "Can I help you?" His tone suggested he hoped the answer was no. "Just getting set up," Diane replied with a smile. "I'll be observing today." "Observing what exactly?" His voice had an edge to it. "Department operations. I'll stay out of the way." She extended her hand. "Diane Reynolds." He looked at her hand for a moment before shaking it briefly. "Detective Wilson. Mind if I ask who sent you?" "City administration," she said, which again wasn't technically a lie. "Just routine assessment." Wilson seemed to relax slightly at that. "Another budget review, huh? Well, you can tell them we need updated computers and at least 3 more detectives if they expect us to keep up with cases." Diane nodded. I'll make a note of that. He lingered for a moment as if waiting for her to say more, then turned away with a shrug. Coffee's over there if you want some. Can't promise it's good. Thanks, Diane said, watching as he walked back to his desk and leaned over to whisper something to his partner, both glancing in her direction. Over the next hour, Diane quietly observed the rhythm of the floor. She noticed immediately how the detectives clustered. Older white men dominated the center of the room, while the few women and officers of color seemed to occupy the edges. When a young black detective entered with case files, several of his colleagues barely acknowledged him. Around 11:30, the room grew louder as a group returned from what appeared to be a successful arrest, backslapping and laughing as they entered. The lead detective, a burly man with a crew cut, spotted Diane and froze momentarily before asking Wilson something. Wilson nodded toward her, and the crew cut detective approached. "I understand you're observing us today," he said, not bothering with introductions. "Lieutenant Harris, I run this division." Diane stood and offered her hand. "Diane Reynolds. Thanks for having me." Harris shook her hand firmly, his grip slightly too tight. Not much choice, was there? Next time a heads up would be appreciated. We could have shown you something worth seeing. "I prefer things unscripted," Diane replied. "Gives me a better sense of day-to-day operations." Harris frowned. "We're not putting on a show here, Ms. Reynolds. This is real police work. Lives are at stake. I understand that, Lieutenant. I've worked in—" "Look," he cut her off, "do what you need to do. But stay out of active investigations and don't distract my detectives. We're understaffed as it is." With that, he walked away, leaving Diane to wonder how many good officers had been discouraged by that same dismissive attitude. By lunchtime, she'd filled several pages of notes. The department had both strengths and concerning weaknesses. Several detectives showed real dedication and skill, but the overall culture seemed resistant to change and mired in outdated practices. Diane decided to find the break room, following the trickle of officers heading out for lunch. The room was small but functional, with tables, vending machines, and a wall of lockers. A television mounted in the corner played the local news with the sound low. She bought a sandwich and water from the vending machine and chose a table in the corner. As she ate, she listened to conversations around her, most centered on cases, sports, or complaints about administration. No one approached or acknowledged her. Halfway through her lunch, the door swung open and 3 officers entered, 2 men and a woman. The men wore patrol uniforms with sergeant stripes, while the woman was in plain clothes with a detective's badge. They laughed together as they entered, clearly comfortable with each other. "I'm telling you," the taller sergeant was saying, "the new chief doesn't stand a chance. This place will eat her alive." Diane froze mid-bite. "You don't know that, Rick," the female detective replied. "Maybe she'll surprise us." "Come on, Patrice," the second sergeant chimed in. "Some outsider with no connection to this precinct? Who's never worked these streets? It's a political appointment, plain and simple." "Word is she was top of her class at the academy," Patrice said, "and her precinct had the biggest crime reduction in the state last year." "On paper, maybe," Rick scoffed. "We all know how those numbers get massaged." The conversation shifted as they noticed Diane sitting alone. Rick nodded at her before turning back to his friends, lowering his voice slightly but not enough. "Who's that?" he asked. "Some consultant or something," the other sergeant replied. "Wilson said she's doing a review." "Great, another suit telling us how to do our jobs." Diane finished her sandwich, taking her time. The 3 officers continued their lunch, occasionally glancing her way. When she finally stood to leave, Rick called out to her, "Finding everything you need?" Diane turned with a smile. "Yes, thank you." "You have an interesting precinct." "Been here 20 years, he said with obvious pride. "Best officers in the city." "I'm sure," Diane replied. "I look forward to seeing more." As she walked toward the door, she heard him mutter to his friends, "Bet she's never seen the inside of a patrol car." If only he knew, Diane thought as she headed back to the detective division. If only he knew that she'd spent 5 years in patrol before making detective, that she'd worked undercover in narcotics, that she'd led the city's most successful community policing initiative. If only he knew that in 1 week she would be sitting in the chief's office, responsible for the futures of every officer in this building, including him. But he would know soon enough, and Diane Reynolds had a feeling that moment would be one worth waiting for. The next morning arrived with clear skies, a stark contrast to yesterday's downpour. Diane arrived earlier, just after 7 a.m., wanting to observe the shift change. She wore a different outfit, charcoal slacks and a burgundy blouse, but kept the same understated professionalism. Her wedding ring and watch were her only accessories, both simple and unflashy. The morning shift brought new faces and fresh energy to the precinct. Diane positioned herself in the break room, a small notebook open beside her coffee cup. She'd chosen a table in the corner with a clear view of the door, her back to the wall, an old habit from her detective days. Officers filed in and out, most grabbing coffee before heading to their posts. Few noticed her, and those who did offered nothing more than a curious glance. She recognized the desk sergeant from yesterday, Burkett, now ending his overnight shift. He looked exhausted, his uniform wrinkled from the long hours. Diane sipped her coffee and observed. The dynamics were fascinating, subtle hierarchies playing out in real time. Who spoke to whom, who sat where, which officers were greeted warmly and which were merely tolerated. Small things that revealed the precinct's true culture. At 7:30, a young officer entered, a black woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Several of the white male officers fell silent as she walked to the coffee machine. She kept her eyes down, her movements efficient, as if trying to make herself invisible. "Morning, Chen," one of the older officers finally said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Morning, Thompson," she replied quietly before quickly exiting with her coffee. Diane made a note. Officer Chen seemed capable but isolated. Someone to follow up with later. By 8 a.m., the break room had emptied as officers dispersed to their assignments. Diane decided to explore other areas of the precinct. She walked past the booking area, where 2 officers processed a disheveled man who appeared intoxicated. Further down, she found the records room, its walls lined with filing cabinets despite the computer age. An older woman looked up from a desk. "Can I help you?" "Just looking around," Diane replied with a smile. "I'm conducting a review for the city." The woman, Nancy, according to her nameplate, sighed heavily. "Another one? We just had an audit last quarter." "Different kind of review," Diane clarified. "I'm looking at operations and culture, not just numbers." Nancy raised an eyebrow. "Culture, huh? Well, good luck with that." She turned back to her computer, effectively dismissing Diane. By mid-morning, Diane had worked her way back to the break room, which was empty except for a few dirty mugs in the sink. She pulled out her tablet and began organizing her notes. The precinct had potential but also deep-rooted issues that would need addressing. Cliques had formed, communication was poor, and there seemed to be an unspoken division between older officers and newer recruits. The door swung open, and 3 officers walked in mid-conversation. Diane recognized one of them as Rick, the sergeant from yesterday's lunch. The other 2, a tall, broad-shouldered white man with salt and pepper hair and a shorter, stockier officer with a buzz cut, were unfamiliar. They stopped talking when they saw her, exchanging glances before moving to the coffee machine. "She's the consultant," Rick explained quietly to the others, though not quietly enough. "Doing some kind of review." The tall officer looked her way. "Another one? Didn't we just have the commissioner's office here last month?" "Different department," Rick replied with a shrug. They never talked to each other. Diane continued working, pretending not to listen while typing notes about interdepartmental communication issues. The irony wasn't lost on her. After fixing their coffee, the 3 officers sat at a table near hers. They resumed their conversation, this time about an upcoming departmental review and potential leadership changes. "So they're really bringing in someone from outside?" the shorter officer asked. "That's what I heard, Doug," Rick replied. "Some captain from the 18th. The 18th? The taller man scoffed. "That's basically a suburban patrol. What do they know about real police work?" Diane knew they were talking about her, though they had no idea. The 18th precinct was indeed her previous post, a district that had transformed under her leadership from a high-crime area to one of the safest in the city. The suburban patrol comment stung, but she kept her expression neutral. "Well, Tom, it's all politics anyway," Rick continued. "Mayor needs to show he's progressive. Diversity hire guaranteed." Diane's fingers paused over her tablet. She'd heard these comments throughout her career, the assumption that her achievements were handed to her rather than earned. She took a deep breath and continued typing. The men lowered their voices slightly but continued their conversation, occasionally glancing her way. Diane could feel the tension building in her shoulders but forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly why her undercover approach was necessary, seeing the unfiltered reality of the precinct culture. After a few minutes, she decided to engage. Information gathering was part of her mission after all. "Excuse me," she said, looking up from her tablet. "I'm new here and wondering if you could help me understand the chain of command." The three officers exchanged looks before the taller one, Tom, responded. "Chain of command? What exactly are you looking for?" His tone was guarded, suspicious. "Just trying to get a sense of how things work," Diane explained. "Who reports to whom, how decisions get made." Tom looked her up and down before responding. "What are you, from internal affairs?" His eyes narrowed. "Or just the cleaning staff?" The other two chuckled at this. Diane didn't flinch. She'd faced far worse in her 20 years on the force. "Maybe she's from HR," Doug added with a smirk. "Here to make sure we've all completed our diversity training." Diane smiled politely. "Just trying to understand how things work around here." Rick leaned forward, coffee mug between his hands. "Look, lady," he said, his voice taking on a condescending tone. "Whatever you're doing here, this is police business. Real police work, not something you'd understand." "And what makes you think I wouldn't understand?" Diane asked calmly. The three exchanged glances again. Tom spoke next. "No offense, but you don't exactly look like someone who's walked the beat or chased down suspects." Diane raised an eyebrow. "And what does someone like that look like?" The question seemed to catch them off guard. Rick recovered first. "Someone who's put in the time, earned their place, not just shown up with a tablet and started asking questions." "I see," Diane said. "And you think you can tell all that just by looking at me?" Doug shifted uncomfortably, but Tom held her gaze. "I've been doing this job for 22 years. I can size people up pretty quick. It's kept me alive," Diane nodded slowly. 22 years is impressive. "You must have seen a lot of changes." "Some things change," Tom replied. "Good police work doesn't." "And what's your definition of good police work?" Diane asked, genuinely curious. The question seemed to take him by surprise. He took a sip of coffee before answering. "Getting criminals off the streets, protecting the public, backing up your fellow officers, community engagement, problem solving, building trust," Diane suggested. Rick snorted. "That's the kind of thinking that's got us filling out forms instead of making arrests." "Interesting perspective," Diane said. She checked her watch, nearly noon already. "Thank you for your insights, gentlemen. I appreciate your time." As she gathered her things, Tom leaned back in his chair. "Word of advice? Whatever report you're writing, try to include something about how we need more officers and better equipment, not just more sensitivity training." Diane paused at the door. "I'll be sure to include everything I observe, good and bad." She felt their eyes on her back as she left. The encounter had been revealing, more so than they could possibly realize. These weren't bad men necessarily, just products of an entrenched culture that rewarded certain behaviors and discouraged others. Changing that culture would be her biggest challenge. Diane spent the rest of the day moving through different departments, observing operations and interactions. She witnessed some excellent police work, particularly from a young, diverse group of officers who seemed isolated from the department's old guard. She also noted troubling patterns, minority citizens' complaints being handled differently, promising officers of color passed over for choice assignments, the dismissive attitudes of certain senior staff. Throughout it all, whenever she crossed paths with Rick, Tom, and Doug, they watched her with thinly veiled disdain. Each time Diane simply nodded and continued her observations, meticulously documenting everything. By the end of the day, she'd filled a dozen pages with notes and observations. Tomorrow, she would focus on the patrol division, riding along if possible. The day after, she would visit the community outreach office, which, according to the precinct map, was tucked away in the basement. That placement alone spoke volumes. As she left the building, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Diane paused on the steps, watching officers changing shifts. In just 4 more days, she would walk through those same doors as Chief Reynolds. The thought brought both anxiety and determination. Her phone buzzed with a text from her husband. "How was day 2 of your secret mission?" She smiled and texted back, "Educational. The officers here have no idea what's coming." As she walked to her car, Diane reflected on the day's encounters. Tom, Rick, and Doug would soon be working under her command. Their attitude toward her would certainly change once they learned her identity. But would their underlying beliefs? That was the real question, and the real challenge that awaited her as the new chief of the 34th Precinct. On her third day at the 34th Precinct, Diane arrived before dawn. She wanted to observe the night shift as they wrapped up and catch the early morning briefing. The parking lot was half empty, and the building seemed quieter, more subdued in the pre-dawn hours. She wore dark jeans and a simple blouse today, practical clothing that wouldn't draw attention. As she entered, the night desk sergeant barely glanced up before buzzing her through. By now, word had spread about the consultant, and while no one knew exactly why she was there, they had grown somewhat accustomed to her presence. The night shift had a different energy. Officers moved slower, their faces etched with the weariness that comes from fighting sleep and staying alert when the body craves rest. In the briefing room, Diane found a seat in the back corner and watched as the night lieutenant wrapped up his shift report. And the situation on Pine Street has calmed down for now, but keep an eye on it. That's the third gang-related incident this month in that area. Officers nodded tiredly, some scribbling notes while others simply stared blankly ahead. Diane noticed one young officer, a Hispanic man, who asked thoughtful questions about community resources for the teens involved in the Pine Street incident. The lieutenant gave short, dismissive answers before moving on. After the briefing, Diane approached the young officer as he poured coffee into a travel mug. "That was a good question you asked," she said. "About the community resources." He looked surprised, then wary. "Thanks, not that it matters. Why not?" Diane asked, pouring herself a cup. "No offense, but you've been here, 2 days? You've seen how things work. Questions like that don't get real answers." "Officer Alvarez," he supplied. "Miguel Alvarez. Officer Alvarez, why do you stay? If you feel your questions don't matter?" He shrugged, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Someone has to care about the community. Might as well be me." He glanced at his watch. "I should go." "End of shift. Do you have a minute?" Diane asked. "I'd like to hear more about your perspective." Alvarez hesitated, then nodded. "Walk with me to my car?" Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of sunrise touching the horizon. As they walked across the parking lot, Alvarez opened up. "I grew up in this district," he said. "Over on Maple Heights. Back then we never trusted cops. Never called them even when we needed help." "What changed?" Diane asked. "I did," he said simply. "Decided maybe the only way to fix the system was from the inside." He unlocked his car, an older model sedan. 3 years in, and some days I wonder if I was wrong. "Because of the resistance to your ideas?" Alvarez leaned against his car. "There are good officers here. Don't get me wrong. But the culture," he shook his head. "The old guard runs things. They don't want to hear about community policing or intervention programs. It's all about arrests and numbers." "Have you thought about transferring?" Diane asked. "Every day," he admitted with a sad smile. "But then who would be here asking the questions nobody wants to answer?" Diane nodded, understanding completely. "People like you make a difference, Officer Alvarez. Even when it doesn't feel like it." He studied her for a moment. "You're not really a consultant, are you?" Diane smiled but didn't answer directly. "I appreciate your insights. Get some rest." As Alvarez drove away, Diane made notes on her phone. Officers like him were exactly what the precinct needed. People who cared about the community they served, who saw beyond arrests to the root causes of problems. But they needed support and leadership to thrive. Back inside, the day shift was arriving. Diane headed for the patrol division, where officers were gathering for morning assignments. She spotted Rick and Tom from yesterday, standing near the front of the room. They noticed her and exchanged glances but said nothing. The patrol lieutenant, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair, was assigning beats and partners. Diane noticed immediately that the less desirable areas went consistently to newer officers and officers of color. The coveted downtown beats went to the veterans, all white, mostly men. When assignments were complete, officers dispersed to their patrol cars. Diane approached the lieutenant. "Lieutenant Harmon?" she said, reading the nameplate. "That's me. You must be the consultant everyone's talking about." Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. "Diane Reynolds. I was hoping I might be able to ride along with a patrol today." Lieutenant Harmon raised an eyebrow. "Ride along? That's not usually part of a consultant's review." "I like to be thorough," Diane replied. "See things firsthand." Harmon considered this, then nodded. Fine. You can ride with Chen. She's covering the northwest sector today. Thank you, Diane said, remembering the young officer from the break room yesterday. Chen. Harmon called across the room. You've got a passenger today. Officer Chen looked up, surprise crossing her face before she nodded. Yes, ma'am. Minutes later, Diane sat in the passenger seat of a patrol car as Officer Chen navigated the morning traffic. The young woman was quiet, focused on the road. Thank you for letting me join you, Diane said, breaking the silence. Not like I had a choice, Chen replied, then winced. Sorry, that was unprofessional. It's fine, Diane assured her. I know this isn't standard procedure. They drove in silence for another block before Chen spoke again. So what exactly are you looking for? In your review? How things really work, Diane said honestly. The good and the bad. Chen glanced at her briefly before returning her eyes to the road. And what have you found so far? A precinct with potential, Diane said carefully. And challenges, Chen snorted softly. That's diplomatic. The radio crackled with a call, a disturbance at a convenience store. Chen responded that they were nearby and would handle it. As she flipped on the lights, she glanced at Diane. Stay in the car, please, for your safety. Diane nodded, though in her 20 years on the force she'd handled hundreds of similar calls. She watched as Chen approached the store with textbook precision, careful, alert, but not aggressive. Inside, Chen spoke with the clerk and a visibly agitated customer, her body language calm and de-escalating. Within minutes, the situation was resolved. No arrest, no paperwork, just good policing. When Chen returned to the car, Diane was impressed. You handled that well, she said. Chen shrugged. Basic conflict resolution. Nothing special. It is special, Diane insisted. Not everyone takes that approach. The rest of the morning followed a similar pattern. Chen responded to calls efficiently, treating everyone she encountered with respect regardless of their circumstances. Between calls, Diane learned that Chen had been with the department for just over 2 years, that she had a degree in criminal justice, and that she hoped to make detective eventually. Though that probably won't happen here, Chen admitted as they parked to grab lunch from a small deli. Why not? Diane asked, though she could guess the answer. Chen gave her a look that suggested the question was naive. Let's just say the detective division has a certain demographic. And you don't fit it, Diane said. 2 strikes against me, Chen replied. I'm a woman and I'm not white. The 34th hasn't had a female detective of color in over a decade. As they ate sandwiches in the patrol car, Diane asked more questions about Chen's experiences. The young officer was hesitant at first, but gradually opened up about the subtle and not-so-subtle barriers she faced daily. Last month I brought in a solid lead on the Wilson robbery case, Chen said. Had a witness, evidence, everything. Thompson, he's one of the detectives, basically patted me on the head and said he'd look into it. Never did? Of course. That must be frustrating, Diane said. It is what it is, Chen replied with forced nonchalance. I do my job, go home, try again tomorrow. After lunch, they responded to several more calls before heading back to the precinct for Chen to file reports. As they pulled into the parking lot, they spotted Rick, Tom, and Doug standing near the entrance, smoking. Great, Chen muttered. The welcoming committee. Diane had noticed Chen tensing up as soon as she saw the 3 officers. Problem? Let's just say they're not my biggest fans, Chen replied, parking the car. As they walked toward the building, Rick called out, Hey, Chen, babysitting duty today? Chen kept walking, her face expressionless, but Diane stopped, turning to face the 3 men. Actually, Officer Chen has been showing me how real police work is done, she said pleasantly. I've been very impressed, Tom snorted. I'm sure filing reports and responding to shoplifting calls was thrilling. We broke up a domestic dispute that could have turned violent, helped an elderly man who'd fallen in his home, and prevented a confrontation between a store owner and a customer, Diane replied calmly. Officer Chen handled each situation with professionalism and compassion. So yes, it was impressive. The 3 men seemed taken aback by her direct response. Doug recovered first, smirking. Well, not all of us can be social workers with badges. No, Diane agreed. Some of you are just badges without the social skills. She turned and continued walking, leaving them momentarily speechless. Chen shot her a surprised look as they entered the building. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I know, Diane replied, but sometimes the truth needs saying. As Chen settled at her desk to file reports, Diane thanked her for the day and continued her observations elsewhere. She spent the afternoon in the records department, the dispatch center, and finally, the community outreach office, which, as she'd suspected, was tucked away in a small room in the basement with outdated materials and a part-time coordinator who seemed defeated by years of insufficient support. By the end of the day, Diane had compiled extensive notes on the precinct's strengths and weaknesses. Tomorrow, she would observe the detective division more closely, and the day after, internal affairs. Her final day would be spent in the training department before the weekend arrived, and her true identity would be revealed at Monday morning ceremony. As she left the building, she spotted Officer Alvarez returning for the night shift. He nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Diane nodded back, thinking about his words from that morning. Someone has to care about the community. Soon, very soon, she would show the 34th Precinct just how much she cared and what real leadership looked like. Diane's week of undercover observation was coming to an end. This morning, Friday, marked her final day before the weekend, and on Monday she would officially step into her role as chief of the 34th Precinct. Only the mayor, the police commissioner, and the retiring Chief Garcia knew of her presence this week. Everyone else, from the lowest rookie to the highest-ranking officers currently in the building, had no idea who had really been watching them. She dressed with particular care today, choosing a professional pantsuit that walked the line between her consultant persona and her true position. No sense in drawing suspicion now, but she wanted to look the part when the moment came. The precinct was unusually busy when she arrived. Officers hurried about with an energy she hadn't seen on previous days. Curious, she stopped a passing clerk. "What's going on today?" "Department-wide meeting at 2, the clerk replied. "Chief Garcia's retirement announcement and introduction of the new chief." Diane nodded, hiding her smile. "Thanks." Throughout the morning, she continued her observations, wrapping up loose ends and filling in gaps in her notes. She spent time in the detective division, watching as cases were assigned and investigations coordinated. Detective Wilson, whom she'd met briefly on her first day, approached her as she sat in the corner. "Last day of your evaluation?" he asked. "Yes," Diane replied. "Thank you for your patience this week." Wilson shrugged. "Find what you were looking for?" "I found a lot," Diane said honestly. "Good and bad." He studied her for a moment. "You know, you're not what I expected." "Oh?" "Most consultants come in with their minds already made up, checklist in hand, looking for problems they've already decided exist." He leaned against a nearby desk. "You actually watched, listened." "That was the point," Diane said. Wilson nodded slowly. "Well, whatever ends up in your report, at least it'll be based on what you actually saw, not what someone at City Hall told you to find." "I appreciate that." "Detective." As Wilson walked away, Diane made a mental note. He might be a potential ally in the changes to come. Someone who valued observation and fairness. She would need officers like him. Around noon, she made her way to the break room, finding it crowded with officers discussing the upcoming meeting. The room fell quiet when she entered, conversations dropping to whispers. "Don't mind me," she said lightly, moving to the coffee machine. "Last day, right?" It was Rick leaning against the counter. "Finished your little study?" "Almost," Diane replied, pouring coffee. "Got any preliminary findings you'd care to share?" Tom asked, his tone making it clear he didn't expect her to say anything worthwhile. Diane turned to face the room. "I've found a precinct with good officers doing important work," she said, meeting various eyes around the room. "I've also found outdated practices, wasted resources, and missed opportunities." "Sounds like typical consultant talk to me," Doug said. Several officers chuckled. "The thing about missed opportunities," Diane continued unperturbed, "is that they can still be found again. This precinct has potential." "We don't need potential," Rick argued. "We need more officers, better equipment, and fewer hoops to jump through." "What you need," Diane said quietly, "is leadership." The room fell silent. Even Rick seemed taken aback by her directness. "We've had 5 different chiefs in 7 years, Tom said after a moment. "Leadership comes and goes. The real work happens despite them, not because of them." Diane considered his words. There was truth there, a truth she would need to acknowledge and address. "Maybe this time will be different," she suggested. Doug laughed. Heard that before. Word is the new chief is some diversity hire from the 18th. Hasn't worked a real beat in years. Several officers shifted uncomfortably, but others nodded in agreement. You shouldn't believe everything you hear. Officer, Diane said, moving toward the door. Sometimes the truth is standing right in front of you. She left them puzzling over her words. As 2 o'clock approached, Diane made her way to the large briefing room on the first floor. It was the only space big enough to hold the entire department at once. She found a seat in the back row, watching as officers and staff filed in, filling every available space. The room buzzed with speculation about the new chief. Snippets of conversation floated around her. I heard it's someone from Boston, probably another politician playing cop. Won't last 6 months, just like the last one. At precisely 2 o'clock, the side door opened and Chief Garcia entered, followed by the mayor and the police commissioner. The room fell silent as the 3 men made their way to the front. Chief Garcia, a distinguished man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face, stepped to the podium first. Thank you all for coming, he began. As most of you know, after 30 years with this department, the last 7 as your chief, I'm stepping down. He spoke for several minutes about his career, the changes he'd seen, and his pride in the department. Diane listened respectfully while scanning the room. She spotted Officer Chen near the front, sitting straight and attentive. Officer Alvarez stood along the wall, arms crossed. Rick, Tom, and Doug sat together in the middle of the room, occasionally whispering comments to each other. It's time for new leadership, Chief Garcia concluded, and I couldn't be more confident in my successor. This department faces challenges, but with the right guidance, I believe you can meet them head on. He gestured to the mayor, who stepped forward. Thank you, Chief Garcia, for your years of service, the mayor said. Today marks not just an end, but a beginning. The 34th Precinct has long been the backbone of our city's law enforcement. But in recent years, we've seen declining community trust, rising response times, and internal challenges that need addressing. A murmur ran through the crowd, some officers shifting defensively in their seats. We needed someone special, the mayor continued. Someone with a proven track record of effective leadership, community engagement, and innovative policing strategies. Someone who could bring fresh perspectives while understanding the unique challenges of this work. The mayor paused, scanning the room. After an extensive national search, we found someone exceptional. This officer has served our department for 20 years, rising through the ranks based on merit and results. Under their leadership, the 18th Precinct saw a 40% reduction in violent crime while significantly improving community relations and officer morale. Diane took a deep breath. This was it. I'm proud to introduce your new chief of police, the mayor announced, Captain Diane Reynolds. The room remained silent, heads turning to look for this unknown captain. Diane stood up from her seat in the back row and began walking toward the front. Recognition dawned gradually across the room, faces registering shock as the consultant made her way to the podium. Rick's jaw literally dropped. Tom sat frozen, blinking rapidly as if trying to clear his vision. Doug's face had gone pale. Throughout the room, officers exchanged stunned glances as the woman they'd dismissed all week took her place at the front of the room. Diane stepped behind the podium, nodding thanks to the mayor and commissioner before turning to face the silent crowd. Thank you, Mayor Phillips. Good afternoon, everyone, she said calmly. Some of you know me as Diane the consultant. As of Monday, I'll be Chief Reynolds. Another wave of murmurs swept through the room. This week, I've had the unique opportunity to observe this precinct as it truly operates. Not the polished version typically presented to a new chief, but the real day-to-day work, challenges, and culture. She paused, letting her gaze move across the room, briefly meeting the eyes of various officers she'd encountered during the week. I've seen dedicated officers doing excellent work despite limited resources. I've seen outdated systems that need upgrading. I've seen talent being overlooked and potential being wasted. Her eyes found Officer Chen, who was watching her with something like hope on her face. I've also seen barriers, some obvious, some subtle, that prevent this precinct from being truly exceptional. Barriers we will break down together. She looked directly at Rick, Tom, and Doug now. The 3 men seemed to shrink under her gaze. Let me be clear. Change is coming to the 34th. Not just for the sake of change, but because this community deserves our best. And right now, they're not getting it. She softened her tone slightly. I know change is uncomfortable. I know many of you are skeptical. You've heard promises before. You've seen chiefs come and go, but I'm asking you to reserve judgment. Watch what I do, not just what I say. A hand went up in the middle of the room. It was Detective Wilson. Yes, Detective, Diane acknowledged. With all due respect, Chief, he said, emphasizing her title slightly. How do we know you understand what we're facing here? The 18th is nothing like the 34th. It was a fair question, delivered without hostility. Diane appreciated that. I started my career in the 12th, she replied. Worked patrol in the highest crime district in the city for 5 years. Made detective, worked homicide for 7 years. Led the narcotics task force before taking command at the 18th. I've made arrests. Been shot at, testified in court, and buried fellow officers. She paused, letting that sink in. So yes, Detective, I understand what you're facing. And I understand what this community is facing too. My job is to bring those perspectives together. Wilson nodded, seemingly satisfied. I'll be meeting with each division over the next 2 weeks. Diane continued. Until then, continue your current assignments. My door will be open for anyone who wants to speak with me directly. She looked around the room once more. We have work to do, officers. Real work. Together. Thank you. As she stepped away from the podium, the room remained silent for a moment before a slow applause began. It wasn't enthusiastic, but it was respectful, cautious. Diane hadn't expected more. Respect had to be earned, especially here. As the meeting broke up and officers filed out, many glanced her way with new eyes, some curious, some worried, some hopeful. Officer Chen gave her a small smile as she passed. Officer Alvarez nodded with something like satisfaction. Rick, Tom, and Doug lingered near the back, their earlier confidence deflated. As Diane approached them, they straightened, suddenly formal. Chief, Rick acknowledged stiffly. Sergeants, Diane replied. I'll see you in my office first thing Monday morning. Yes, ma'am, they answered in unison. As they turned to leave, Diane added, and gentlemen, I expect a full briefing on the Pine Street situation. The real police work happening there. The three exchanged glances before nodding and walking away. Chief Garcia approached, offering his hand. Well played, Reynolds. They never saw it coming. Diane shook his hand. It wasn't about surprising them, Chief. It was about seeing the truth. And did you? He asked. Diane watched as the last officers left the room. I saw enough to know we have a long road ahead, she said. But I also saw enough to know it's worth traveling. Monday would be the real beginning, the real test. But for now, Diane Reynolds, soon to be chief of the 34th Precinct, allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The hardest part wasn't revealing her identity. It was what came next. Earning their trust, changing the culture, and making the 34th Precinct what it could and should be. That work started now. Monday morning arrived with a steady rain, much like the day Diane had first walked into the 34th Precinct. Only this time, she wasn't dressed in civilian clothes with her credentials hidden away. Today, she wore her full-dress uniform, complete with the polished badge that now read Chief. Her husband had taken a photo of her before she left home, both of them barely containing their excitement. Show them what real leadership looks like, he'd said, straightening her collar. Now, as she pulled into her reserved parking space, the one marked Chief, Diane took a deep breath. The weekend had given everyone time to process Friday's revelation. Today would set the tone for everything that followed. As she entered the building, the difference was immediate. The desk sergeant, not Burkett today, but an older officer named Reyes, jumped to his feet. Good morning, Chief Reynolds. Good morning, Sergeant, Diane replied warmly. How are we doing today? All quiet so far, ma'am, Reyes answered. Clearly nervous. Good. And please, no need for ma'am. Chief is fine. She made her way through the building, noting how conversations paused as she passed. Officers nodded respectfully, some offering quiet greetings. The atmosphere was tense, uncertain. They were waiting to see what kind of leader she would be. The chief's office was spacious, with large windows overlooking the street. Chief Garcia had cleared out his personal items over the weekend, leaving behind only the official furniture and equipment. A stack of personnel files sat on the desk, along with operation reports and budget documents. On top was a handwritten note from Garcia. The ship is yours now. Steer it well. Diane hung up her coat and settled behind the desk. First on her agenda, the meeting with Sergeants Rick Thompson, Tom Mitchell, and Doug Barker, the three officers who had dismissed and belittled her throughout her observation week. At precisely 8 a.m., there was a knock at her door. "Come in," she called. The three men entered, standing stiffly at attention. Gone were the smirks and casual postures. Each wore a perfectly pressed uniform and a carefully neutral expression. "Sergeants," Diane greeted them. "Please sit down." They took the 3 chairs facing her desk. Back straight, eyes forward. "You wanted a briefing on the Pine Street situation." "Chief," Rick began immediately, opening a folder. "In a moment," Diane said, raising a hand. "First, I think we should address the elephant in the room, don't you?" The 3 men exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Chief, about last week," Tom started. "We had no idea who you were and—" "That's precisely the point, Sergeant Mitchell," Diane interrupted calmly. "You had no idea who I was, yet you made assumptions based on what? My gender, my race? Certainly not my qualifications, since you never bothered to ask about those." The men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "With all due respect, Chief," Doug said, "we were just being honest," Diane finished for him. "Yes, I know. And that honesty revealed a great deal about the culture of this precinct." She leaned forward. "Let me be clear. I'm not interested in apologies. I'm not interested in explanations. What I am interested in is whether the 3 of you, veteran officers with significant influence in this department, are capable of change." "What kind of change exactly?" Rick asked cautiously. Diane smiled. "I'm glad you asked." She opened a folder on her desk. "I've reviewed your service records. Each of you has impressive accomplishments. Sergeant Thompson, your arrest record is exemplary. Sergeant Mitchell, your tactical expertise is noted in multiple commendations. Sergeant Barker, your knowledge of this district is unparalleled." She closed the folder. "Yet none of you has advanced beyond sergeant despite your years of service. Do you know why?" None of them answered. "Because police work in the 21st century requires more than arrests and tactical skills. It requires community engagement, problem solving, and the ability to work with all kinds of people." She looked each man in the eye. "Skills you've consistently undervalued." "With respect, Chief," Rick said, "we're street cops. Always have been." "And the street has changed, Sergeant," Diane replied. "The community has changed. Policing must change with it." She stood up and moved to the front of her desk, sitting on the edge to be closer to them. "I'm instituting new protocols effective immediately. Each patrol team will include at least 1 officer with less than 5 years' experience paired with a veteran. Community engagement metrics will be weighted equally with arrest statistics and performance reviews. And every officer, regardless of rank or time in service, will complete updated training in de-escalation techniques and cultural competency." "That's going to face resistance," Tom warned. "I'm counting on it," Diane said with a smile. "That's where you 3 come in." The sergeants exchanged confused glances. "You want us to help push these changes?" Doug asked incredulously. "Precisely," Diane confirmed. "Who better to convince the old guard than 3 of its most respected members?" "And if we don't agree with all these changes?" Rick asked. Diane's expression remained pleasant, but her voice took on a steely edge. "Then you're welcome to request a transfer to another precinct. But before you decide, I'd like you to come with me." She stood and walked to the door, indicating they should follow. Puzzled, the 3 sergeants trailed behind her as she led them through the building, down to the first floor, and into a small conference room. Inside, waiting nervously, were Officer Chen, Officer Alvarez, and 3 other young officers, all people of color, all relatively new to the force. "Please sit down, everyone," Diane said, gesturing to the chairs. For the next hour, Diane facilitated a conversation unlike any the 34th Precinct had seen before. She asked the young officers to share openly and honestly their experiences at the precinct, the barriers they faced, the dismissal of their ideas, the isolation they felt. At first, they were hesitant, glancing warily at the 3 sergeants. But as Diane gently encouraged them, their stories began to flow. Officer Chen described having her reports repeatedly questioned despite flawless work. Officer Alvarez recounted his community outreach ideas being ignored or dismissed. The others shared similar experiences, being passed over for training opportunities, assigned consistently to the least desirable shifts, subjected to jokes that weren't really jokes. Throughout it all, Diane watched the 3 sergeants. At first they sat stiffly, defensively. But as the stories continued, something changed. Rick's brow furrowed in genuine concern. Tom looked increasingly troubled. Doug, who had made some of the most dismissive comments to Diane during her observation week, stared at the table, his expression a mix of shame and revelation. When the young officers had finished, Diane turned to the sergeants. Questions? Thoughts? After a moment of silence, Rick spoke. I had no idea it was this bad, he admitted. Why didn't any of you come to us directly? Chen gave him a look. Would you have listened, Sergeant? The question hung in the air. I'd like to think I would have, Rick said slowly. But honestly, probably not. Not really. It was the most honest thing Diane had heard from him. This is your precinct, Diane said, addressing everyone in the room. All of you. And it will only work if all of you work together. Not as us versus them, but as one unified department serving one diverse community. She stood. I've assigned each sergeant to mentor one of you younger officers, she announced. You'll patrol together, share ideas, learn from each other. After 3 months, we'll meet again to discuss what's working and what isn't. There were nods around the table, some more enthusiastic than others, but none openly resistant. Thank you all, Diane concluded. That's all for now. As the young officers filed out, Diane held back the 3 sergeants. Now, she said, tell me about Pine Street. For the next 30 minutes, the sergeants briefed her on the ongoing gang tensions in that area, a comprehensive, detailed report that demonstrated their deep knowledge of the district. When they finished, Diane nodded appreciatively. Good work. Now, what community resources have you connected with to address the underlying issues? The sergeants exchanged glances. Community resources? Tom repeated. Yes, youth programs, job training, family services, the preventive measures that might keep the next generation of kids from joining gangs in the first place. That's not really our department, Rick admitted. It is now, Diane said firmly. I want a list of every community organization working in that area on my desk by tomorrow. Officer Alvarez already has some ideas. He'll be working with you. As the sergeants left her office, Diane could see the wheels turning in their minds. They weren't fully convinced yet, but they were thinking, and that was a start. The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of meetings, briefings, and introductions. Diane made a point of visiting every department, speaking with officers at all levels. By late afternoon, she'd outlined her immediate priorities and shared them with her command staff, a mix of existing leaders and a few officers she planned to promote based on merit rather than seniority. As the day wound down, Diane stood at her office window, watching officers changing shifts in the parking lot below. The rain had stopped and weak sunshine broke through the clouds. A fitting metaphor, she thought, for the 34th Precinct's future. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called. Detective Wilson entered carrying a file. The case reports you asked for, Chief. Thank you, Detective. Just leave them on the desk, Wilson hesitated. There's something else. Yes? The department's talking about you, about today. Diane turned from the window. And I think you've got them thinking, Wilson said. Even the diehards like Thompson and Mitchell. Good, Diane replied. Thinking is where change begins. Wilson nodded and turned to leave, then paused. It won't be easy, you know. Changing this place, Diane smiled. The most important things rarely are, Detective. After he left, Diane returned to the window. The 34th Precinct had a long way to go. Old habits, entrenched attitudes, systemic problems. None of these would disappear overnight. But today she'd planted seeds of change. Some would grow quickly. Others would need time and nurturing, and a few might never take root at all. But standing there, watching her officers, all of her officers, Diane Reynolds felt something she hadn't expected on her first official day as chief. Hope. Not just for the department, but for the community it served. The real work was just beginning, and she was ready.